So I'm delighted that the next thing on the programme is a keynote lecture from Peter Arlett. Now, many of you will know Peter Arlett. He's the head of Data Analytics and Methods Task Force at the European Medicines Agency. So he leads operations and transformation on clinical evidence at the EMA, including clinical trials, real-world evidence, safety reporting, and data science, including AI. He has many other important roles, which you can read in the booklet. But I think I would like to just now pass over to Peter, who was fundamentally a physician before he became so important.
Don't know quite what to say after that. It's not often that I'm speechless. Thank you very much to the project for inviting me. Thank you also for a great day. I've been living in the Netherlands for 5 years. I've got two children of school age, and I've never been here, so now I know what to do this weekend. It looks brilliant. Also, thank you for the sort of educational element of today. I am involved, I don't want to say superficial because that sounds negative, but I'm often involved in discussions about decentralized elements and about innovation in clinical trials. And it's really nice to have a day to do a bit of a deep dive, actually, to understand the next level, some of the issues that we're talking about. And another thing that has come to my mind is that sometimes the best presentations you do at the last minute. Now, because the project management and events organizers here are so efficient, the slides I did were a week old. I wish I had been writing them during the meeting, because some of the things I've written, actually, I think I've been told during the course of the day aren't quite right. But anyway, you can see if you can spot those as I go through. So I decided not to do as I was told. And I was asked to talk about the future of decentralized trials or decentralized elements. And I decided to take 3 steps backwards and talk about the future of clinical evidence. Now, one of the reasons that I gave a rather full description of my responsibilities at the agencies that I read out was that I don't just look after the clinical trials for EMA, I also look after the real-world evidence and the AI and the safety. And essentially, you can summarize that as clinical evidence. And I think it's a really useful set of responsibilities to put together because it takes you out of the silos, because clinical trials, particularly versus observational research, is very often seen as different silos with different specialists, and one doesn't believe the other and so on. Almost tribal, I would say. So let's talk about clinical evidence. Now, my Spanish mother-in-law always says, don't ever hold back from pointing out the bleeding obvious. Now, she doesn't use those words exactly, but I've got a couple of slides that point out the bleeding obvious here, okay? So clinical trials generate evidence to develop medicines, to optimize their use and to address unmet medical needs. And fundamentally, that's what we're trying to achieve, and that's through excellent clinical evidence. Location matters. So I know it's not the main focus today, but this is the location of clinical trials, the location of R&D, the location of research. So there are more opportunities for EU patients to access innovative treatments and medicines if clinical trials are conducted in Europe. We can also have faster access in the EU market for medicines when clinical trials are conducted here. There's good evidence that if a company has done their big pivotal clinical trials in European markets, they will get authorization early here, launch here. And of course, there's a positive feedback loop as well. More research means more high-quality healthcare jobs, better healthcare delivery. I know you all know that, but I think sometimes it's worth pointing out the bleeding obvious. The other point I wanted to make was that it's probably the key line on this slide is the one at the bottom, that randomized controlled trials remain the core of clinical evidence. And although I spend quite a lot of my time promoting having an open mind about observational research using electronic health records, for example, I and everybody else I work with is absolutely convinced that clinical trials remain central, particularly to demonstrating that new products work. So clinical trials give us clinical evidence, and that then supports marketing authorization applications, health technology assessment, long-term efficacy and safety, understanding of medicine, so optimizing the use of medicines. Now, I'll spend a minute or two on this paper. I think the concepts put forward in this paper, called Clinical Evidence 2030, which was published at the beginning of the year, will stand the test of time and scrutiny. The actual concepts here started as a presentation that I gave about 4 years ago, and it resonated with the audience I was presenting to, and then I finessed it over a number of presentations, and then finally we wrote it down in a paper. But the idea here is that excellent clinical evidence is at the core of a marketing authorization dossier and at the core of decision making, and that these principles should drive what we're doing. So the patient voice should guide every step of the way, that evidence generation should be planned, and that planning should be guided by purpose, data, knowledge, and expertise. Now, I'm not going to say more about patient voice now because a lot has been said today, but I will say a few things about planning. Many people in the audience, particularly on the industry side, will know that there's good evidence that if you talk to the regulators early and get expert advice on the design of your clinical evidence generation, and you stick to that advice, you're more likely to have a successful marketing authorization application. So in other words, get a product on the market. A lot of the advice that's been done in the past and a lot of drug development that's done in the past has not been informed by what's gone on before. And so that's why we've put here that we should ensure that the design of a clinical development is based on data and knowledge. And partly that's been because data and knowledge was not always easily available. We didn't know what clinical trials, or it was difficult to find out what clinical trials had been done in a particular therapeutic area. Certainly negative trials were not always published, etc. But we really need to sort that out so that knowledge drives better improvements in R&D. The research, before we go to number 3, the research question should drive the evidence choice, and this should embrace the spectrum of data and methods. This was my point about silos, if you like, and my point where I started about observational research, data science, clinical trials being side by side and complementary. Frequently, the best research method to address a particular research question will be a clinical trial, but it won't always. And we need to be open to think, what's the research question, what's the best way of addressing it? Clinical trials remain core, but should be smarter, better, and faster. Real-world evidence should be enabled, and we should establish its value in different use cases. And finally, high transparency will underpin societal trust. And also high transparency feeds into that second bullet point about evidence generation and planning being guided by data and knowledge and guidance. So these principles, I believe, will stand the test of time. I certainly hope so. Now, this was the slide that I wish I'd written this afternoon and not a week ago. It's interesting because it's there's lots of assumptions that have gone into this slide, and I suspect there were some of the assumptions that went into the original planning of trials at home. So decentralized elements in clinical trials can enhance recruitment and representativeness by making trials accessible for a wider range of patients, some with no other opportunities to receive treatment from a wider range of geographical locations. I still believe that's true. I think there's not been enough research to demonstrate that. I certainly hope it's still true, let's put it like that. Increased convenience, which enables patient retention and engagement, leads to less dropout rates. I don't think we've demonstrated that, have we? Exactly, it was one demonstration or one pilot. Again, I think it's highly likely to be true. And I think if there's one compelling argument for decentralized elements, it's bringing the trial to the patient and the convenience element. Reduced burden on patients and the healthcare system potentially, and I'm glad we put the word potentially in there, potentially reducing costs. I agree that I think once there's more widespread uptake of decentralized elements, I think it will have the effect of reducing costs. A demonstration project isn't the way to do that, probably. And finally, innovation can come through decentralized elements. I think that's the point we're trying to make there. So we wrote that before, I have to say, I hadn't read all the papers coming out of the project, but I've seen some of their summary results this morning, and I think that would have nuanced the slide, perhaps. Now, I just want to go sideways slightly and talk about some of the things that we're doing to strengthen clinical research in general, or not research, clinical trials in Europe. So it's not specific to decentralized trials. The point of this slide is to say we're at a bit of a turning point. I took over responsibility for clinical trials in 2001 6 months before the go-live of the clinical trials regulation. It was quite a baptism of fire, I can tell you. But essentially, we've come out of a pandemic, we've been implementing new regulation. It's only since February this year that transition period for new regulation has finished. We're still at the time of optimizing the operation of the current clinical trials regulation, and there's so much more to do in terms of optimizing the clinical trial information system, CTIS, in terms of further harmonization between the member states, in terms of just better ways of working. And we will do better. There's no doubt. The motivation, the convergence of thinking between different stakeholders is very high. And then we're told that very soon we'll have proposals for new legislation, so through the Biotech Act, and that's no secret. It's well and truly in the public domain, and it looks like that legal proposal will be within months rather than years. So we really are at a pivot point now. My responsibility is making sure that with the member states and the Commission that the clinical trials regulation, current clinical trial regulation, works as efficiently and effectively as possible. And we mustn't, in my view, allow the potential of new legislation to distract us from now and next year and the year after, where we still won't have that legislation operational. We need to really improve what we've got at the moment, and we will do that. So you've heard of accelerating clinical trials in the EU, ACT-EU. One of the strengths of this is that it brings people together. So before the clinical trials regulation, the member states did what the member states do. The Commission had its own responsibilities, the EMA had its own responsibilities, but we weren't pushing in the same direction necessarily. With the clinical trials regulation, there was an opportunity for change, and we put together this, if you like, a transformation initiative, very much regulatory-led, which brings together Commission, heads of the national agencies and EMA. At a jingoistic level, but I think it's actually quite nice. We want better, faster and smarter clinical trials in the EU. And it came at the right time because now across the stakeholder spectrum, everybody is saying we need to reinvigorate the clinical research environment in Europe. And so I think ACT-EU will play a part, and particularly, and I'm preempting a slide that's coming later, the multi-stakeholder approach, where we bring, 2 days ago we had a big face-to-face meeting in Amsterdam of our multi-stakeholder platform. It really is going to be the engine room of change, I believe, because it's building consensus and it's breaking down silos between voices of different stakeholder groups. So I just want to show you a few examples of some of the things that ACT-EU is doing. I love TrialMap. It's so simple. All we've done is put the public data from CTIS, the Clinical Trials Information System, into a map and then put a search engine on top. Now, I say it's simple. It took some very clever data scientists to do it. I'm really pleased to say that since Wednesday, it's now available in all EU languages. That actually, it's not just pretty, it's not just transparency, it's empowering. Because I don't think most patients or even healthcare professionals would have had a clue how to find recruiting an open clinical trial before TrialMap. Maybe if it was a very specialist disease, rare disease, specialist network, they would have known exactly what was going on. But for most conditions, they wouldn't have had a clue where to start. They would have started Googling and God knows what would have popped up. With TrialMap, you can click on the button that gives you currently recruiting only. You just zoom in and find a trial site near you under a disease area. Now, clearly, you then have to work out whether it's really the disease and the conditions and the inclusion and exclusion, etc. But it also gives you the name and the address and the phone number and the email of the principal investigator. I mean, that's empowerment to patients. And that really, I believe, could significantly increase recruitment going forward. So little things all come together to make things better. So TrialMap, great. Well, I would say that. It was my team that built it. Now, Monique Al mentioned the pilots, and so I'm just going to re-emphasize that. So these two pilots have been under the umbrella of ACT-EU. The one on the left brings together the scientific advice that the Scientific Advice Working Party of the EMA gives. That's advice on how to generate evidence that would be needed for a successful marketing authorization application. and it puts it together with the more regulatory clinical trial application type advice from the Clinical Trials Coordination Group. We've had 11 applications over just over a year, 8 are concluded, 3 ongoing. The other pilot is complementary, and it is just, if you like, the regulatory part, and it's run through the Clinical Trial Coordination Group, CTCG. Monique is the vice chair. We've had 17 applications, and it's basically how to put my application together, very practical stuff. The sponsors that have done these pilots seem to like it very much. Of course, they want more. They want it to also cover devices. They want ethics bodies to be there, systematic. But within the scope that we're piloting, they like it very much. We haven't yet decided what will come next. So the pilots remain open. There are a number of voices saying, shouldn't this just be a permanent offering? Shouldn't this be the new normal, that sponsors can get this kind of a joined up advice to get it right first time, if you like. So watch this space. But I think it's been a really nice exercise. Helga, you mentioned sandboxing. In a way, this was a form of sandboxing. We pilot a different regulatory process. It looks successful. We are supporting non-commercial sponsors. This is at a European level. We've got a specialised help desk if non-commercial sponsors get into difficulties with their clinical trial application in CETIS. We've got this map. It doesn't look as beautiful as the trial map, but this is a map so you can go country by country and look at the different national regulatory measures to support non-commercial sponsors. We're also working with individual national competent authorities to hold webinars to help understand about clinical trials regulations, CETIS, support measures and so on. So we're doing quite a lot through ACT-EU for non-commercial sponsors. Now this, some people find it dull. I find it quite exciting. It took over a year to negotiate this. So these are key performance indicators, and there's 2. For the European clinical trial environment. And as far as I'm aware, we are the first region or authority, I know we're a group of authorities, but let's call it authority, in the world to actually set ourselves targets for better. So I think it's quite brave. Then, of course, somebody comes along and says it's not ambitious enough, and then somebody else comes along and says, oh, my God, there's a risk you won't achieve it. Well, maybe we won't, maybe we will, but we're putting our head above the parapet, and we're going to have a go. So on the left-hand side, we say we want EU to be more attractive, and the way we're going to measure attractive is more multinational clinical trials, and we're saying 500 more within 5 years. Now, that's, you could say that that's under-ambitious, but we've still got to do it. And then faster access to treatment. We debated how to measure this, but we came up with this time from a clinical trial application to the recruitment of the first patient. Now, not all of that is regulatory. I mean, in fact, the minority of it is regulatory, but the clinical trial assessment part is part of it, and then, of course, there's contracts and so on and so forth. But the idea would be we go from about 50% of trials at the moment start recruitment within 200 days. We go to 66% within 5 years. And again, some would say that's not ambitious enough, but at least it's a public target and we will measure ourselves. Starting in the first quarter next year, we'll have public dashboards on the ACT-EU website so you can see how we're doing against these targets. So, now I've already preempted this slide. A multi-stakeholder approach is probably the secret ingredient. And we set up the multi-stakeholder platform, 2004, but it's really got going in the last year or so. We had this great face-to-face meeting on Wednesday. Forgive me for sounding like a Spice Girl, but I mean, we now know what stakeholders want, what they really want. So what they want from regulators is faster authorization of trials. That's clear. That's clear, and that's why it's biggest in the middle. But they also want a risk-based approach. They want model contracts. They want initiatives to support recruitment. They want streamlined ethical input. They want only critical questions in the requests for information, RFIs, and they want increased flexibility. And there's obviously more detail behind all of this. But once you know what stakeholders want, you can start to align and prioritize and, one by one, deliver against them. And that's very powerful, in my view. Now, Monique covered this already. This slide has got the URL link. It was published, was it 24 or 48 hours ago, this updated document on decentralized trials, UDRELEX Volume 10. So I'm sure the slides will be distributed. Just click on the link and it'll take you through. So I'm nearly done. Legal, policy and technical opportunities. We have opportunities to make things better. And the Biotech Act is coming. It's out in the public domain. I'm not stealing anybody's thunder by saying that. It's going to come as a legal proposal quite soon. It will aim to boost innovation and competitiveness and to improve and simplify the regulatory landscape, particularly clinical trials regulation. AI holds huge promise. I'm not going to talk any more about that. It would be a whole workshop on its own. And there's hard work, going on the modernisation of CETIS. So CETIS was originally, it was started to be built in 2014. It took almost 10 years before it went live, and the technology that it was built with originally is already out of date, as well as actually we now have 3 years of learnings from it, because designing a system when you're not operating it, you often make things more complicated than they need to be. So the modernisation programme is going to run over the next 3 years or so to make sure that we've got a better future-proof system. It's already much better than it was when it went live. It was horrible when it went live, as most of you told me on a daily basis. It's now already much better, but it will be better and better and better. You heard it here. Now, I was asked to talk about the future. I came up with 4 because the colleague that gave me the template for the slides gave me a 4-pointed star. So I mean, it had to be 4 predictions. And I was going to give you just one prediction, which was data was going to be my prediction. But I decided I had to have 4 because it had 4 points on the star. And I'm not sure if these are predictions or wishes. And sometimes we mix these things up. And so in part it might be what I would like. And I say I on behalf of all the stakeholders we talk to. I start top left, patient central. On Wednesday, there were some really insightful comments about making sure that patient engagement is meaningful and not tokenism. And we hear it a lot. I'm now speaking as an individual rather than on behalf of EMA. There were other comments about, do we really have to engage clinical trial by clinical trial with patients? Couldn't we have a patient engagement platform? Couldn't we share transparently the advice given in disease X so that other clinical trial sponsors could share it? I think it would be very powerful. And whether EMA can do something in that space or whether it's for another organisation, I don't know. But let's talk about it, because I think that would be an accelerator in my view. If we then go to bottom left, I've already mentioned this. Regulation is going to get better. We are going to improve the operation of the current clinical trials regulation over the next year or 2, and then we will get a step change further improvement with the implementation of the Biotech Act. That's just going to happen. Innovation enabled. Look, I mentioned decentralized elements. I do believe decentralized elements will increase recruitment, will increase diversity in clinical trials, and will make evidence better. There are lots and lots of other novel approaches to generating evidence and to interpreting data, which I think we should further explore. The whole interface with healthcare data it's a divide at the moment. And again, going back to the discussions we had on Wednesday, people were talking about the European Health Data Space, but, there was a presentation on the European Health Data Space. This will enable greater access to data. Well, let's hope it does. But the people in the room who were largely clinical trialists didn't ask any questions about it, because I just think these are 2 different worlds and we need to find a way of bridging between them. Because if we can bridge and enrich for enrollment, for follow-up, for comparison, I think from an evidence point of view, we will be making the world a much better place. For some reason, it's in a smaller font. It shouldn't be. AI-enabled processes. What's interesting, and we had a lot of discussion on Wednesday about AI, is that industry is using AI in its daily operations in clinical trials already, academia less so. I think this will, absolutely convinced it's going to be transformational in all of the steps in the R&D, all of the R&D steps. And finally, it's not crystal clear what data-driven decision-making means. It comes back to trial map. that I showed you earlier, and Monique mentioned it in her presentation, we have very rich data from CETIS that we've never had before. We've got more than 10,000 clinical trial applications in CETIS, and over time, every year that's going to be another 3,000 or whatever it is, 4,000, 5,000, and then the results will start coming in. And over time, with the modernization, we'll probably have more structured data as well. And with that, we have an incredible resource to support research and decision-making. So go back to my principle earlier about excellent clinical evidence. Inform your drug development, inform your clinical trial design on what's happened before. If you've got tens of thousands of clinical trials, searchable and data analyzable, I think that's enormously powerful for clinical trial design, for evidence design, but also for decision-making on the authorization, the health technology assessment, and the payment of medicines, as well as decisions in the clinic. So hopefully by 2030, no, not hopefully, for certain by 2030, we will have better, faster and smarter clinical trials in the EU, and we will be creating a favourable environment for clinical research and delivery for the patients of Europe. And on that, I leave you to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.